Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Last Saturday's presidential and legislative elections caught the world's attention. The ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, won a historic third administration. Current Vice President Lai Ching-te will be the next president of Taiwan. However, the DPP lost the majority in the legislative yuan. So beyond headlines today, we want to dive deeper with the spokesperson of the DPP, Vincent Chao, and Ryan Haas of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Vincent and Ryan.
Thank you, Wenqi. Thanks for having us on the show. It's great to see you, Ryan. It's great to be connected online. Just a quick point. I was the spokesperson for the Lai Ching-te campaign, but I'm not currently the spokesperson for the DPP. But nevertheless, I was very, very happy to have played a role in helping increase international exposure for the Lai campaign.
Well, thanks for the clarification. Well, now that we know that your official title was the spokesperson for the campaign, so give our audience a sense of the election outcomes, both presidential and legislative. Any surprise from the party's point of view?
Well, Wenqi, that's a great question. And certainly one interesting point was how accurate our polls were in Taiwan. I don't think our friends from America could say quite the same, but our polls were actually surprisingly accurate, particularly those from a number of reputable pollsters. And so I think the presidential elections largely fell in line with expectations, so to say, that while we secured a victory, we did not secure a majority, and that we did see increased votes for the TPP in particular. And in many senses, they had continued to surpass expectations, particularly amongst young people and undecided voters. So that's the first kind of observation from the presidential part. On the legislative part, I will say we did slightly better than I think some people had expected. Although it's not been a perfect result, obviously, we were not able to secure a legislative majority like we did in 2016 and 2020. But nevertheless, I think it wasn't a weak showing, particularly in the South. We won every seat south of Chiayi, including Chiayi. We had continued parity in New Taipei City. We held on to a couple of seats in Taipei, So all in all, I would say that it wasn't ideal, obviously, but nevertheless, it wasn't an abject disappointment either. Now, what we have going forward, Wenqi, is the problem of governance, because we do have a divided government. And we've had experience before between 2000 and 2008. Things didn't pan out very well, particularly on the defense side. And so I think many folks here are hoping to avoid a repeat of what we saw in years past and find ways of governing effectively despite a divided government.
Yeah, so it sounds like it was as expected, at least from Taiwan or Taipei's point of view. And Ryan, what about the reactions from Washington, D.C.? Any surprise? We saw that the President Biden was asked by the press, and he gave a very short and immediate response. We do not support independence. What's your interpretation of his response? And also, then, DC sent this private delegation of former senior officials to Taiwan, bipartisan. And what does that mean?
Well, Wenqi, first of all, let me congratulate Vincent and the Taiwan people for, as Vincent said, a clean, clear election with a clean, clear outcome that all major political parties and candidates accepted. I think Taiwan has shown the way for the United States. We have our own election later this year, and I hope that it resembles and reflects the experience that Taiwan just provided for us. My own sense is that most people in Washington expected the outcome that we saw in the election. Much as Vincent said, we've all been following the polls closely. The polls tended to be very accurate in reflecting and measuring public sentiment. And I think that many people in Washington feel comfortable working with President-elect Lai and his team, including Vincent, because we have years of experience of building and developing a relationship and narrowing any divides that may exist between our respective viewpoints or perspectives on things. And so I think that there's a just sort of an enthusiasm to get to work, to build upon the significant progress that has been made in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship under President Tsai and to carry it forward. In terms of President Biden's comments, it's very difficult for me to get inside of his head to explain what he was thinking when he was responding to a question that was yelled at him by a reporter. But my presumption is that he wanted to make the point that if there are troubles in the Taiwan Strait, they will not be troubles of America's making. They will not be troubles of Taiwan's making. And so I think it was pretty much an effort to try to put the focus where it should be on trying to preserve and protect cross-strait stability, and suggesting that if that is going to be the case, then all three parties need to do their part.
But
and
it's
finally,
interesting. It's interesting how it literally came off top of his head. I mean, it almost as if he was thinking about the winning party, in some way implies independence, and he wants to send a message that the U.S. doesn't support independence, or maybe he wants to send a message to Beijing that we do not support independence, even with the DPP win. Is that the right way to look at it?
I don't think so. I think that President Biden deserves the benefit of the doubt. This is the first president in American history that has said 4 times that America would come to Taiwan's defense if Taiwan came under attack. No other president prior to him has said so. Let's just all agree that President Biden is a lot of things. He's an empathetic, energetic, caring person, but rhetorical precision may not be a strong suit of his. And so I think that he was just sort of reflecting what was on his mind at the time that someone yelled a question at him, literally, as he was walking. So I think the most important thing to do is to follow actions. And the actions are that the United States dispatched a team of respected senior former officials from both the Democratic and Republican Party to meet with their counterparts of all political parties in Taiwan before the outcome of the election was even known. And this, I think, suggests that the United States is very committed to continuing on a bipartisan basis in both Washington and Taipei to build the relationship going forward.
Is there anything unusual about dispatching this delegation?
No, it's actually consistent with past practice. In 2016, Bill Burns, who is then the recently retired Deputy Secretary of State, went to Taipei right after the election. In 2000, Lee Hamilton traveled to Taipei. So there's a lot of precedent for this, and I don't think it came to a surprise to anyone who follows these issues in either Taipei or Beijing that Washington would do so.
Well, thank you for that. Vincent, now, you were dealing with a lot of international press during the campaign, and it seemed that most of them really just wanted to focus on President-elect Lai Ching-te's cross-strait policy based on his past remarks, whether, for example, he would declare formal independence or how he would respond to Beijing coercion. In terms of messaging, what was at that time the campaign strategy? And did it work from your point of view? And moving forward, what will be the messaging be between now and the inauguration in May?
Well, first of all, Wenxi, I just wanted to follow up on what Ryan said, and I was fortunate to have been in the room both in 2016 and a couple of days ago when we had met with the retired senior officials delegation from the U.S. And so it is clearly within precedent and an important gesture of support for not only Taiwan's new administration or coming administration, but also democracy in general, and that the United States stands with Taiwan during our democratic process and certainly following it as well. And to the comments that I think President Biden made, I don't think any of us can speak for him. Maybe Ryan can, a lot more than I can, at least. But the truth of the matter is that I do think there has been very consistent messaging from the United States that, look, neither Taiwan or the U.S. is out to change the status quo. We're firmly in support of maintaining peace and stability. We're firmly in support of continuing the steady and pragmatic, steadfast policies that President Tsai Ing-wen has put in place over the past 8 years. And I think Biden's comment was an important signal to the PRC as well, that nothing's going to change in that respect, neither in Washington or in Taipei. And so Beijing, as a result, shouldn't overreact. And I think that, by and large, has also answered parts of your question, which is this. We've been very consistent throughout the entire campaign that President Tsai has won international respect and recognition of her pragmatic and really consistent policies that she's followed on cross-strait issues. She's maintained the 4 commitments. She's talked about the status quo, the ROC constitution order. She's made continuous gestures to suggest that Taiwan, again, is not out there to provoke, but we're going to stand up for our principles and our values. And this is precisely what the framework now President-elect Lai Ching-te has in place. If you look at his campaign messaging, we've been very, very on point throughout the campaign. Status quo. We've talked about the ROC. We've talked about continuing the policies that President Tsai has put in place. I want to refer comments back to January 13th, just a couple of days ago, when he took when he made his remarks following the election victory. And these were the very points he emphasized again and again. And so, I mean, I'll put it this way. It's a policy that works. I mean, it's a policy that shows Taiwan as a responsible, pragmatic stakeholder. And we're going to continue this policy that's firmly within our own interests, but the international communities as well.
I think it's loud and clear that Tsai Ing-wen, 路线, Tsai Ing-wen approach is what President-elect Lai will continue. However, President Lai is not President Tsai. So even though the policy is going to look the same, but the execution and the practice of it may be different. And so, and also, you know, obviously the macro environment and other things. I think, you know, from an outsider's point of view, I think the most important message that probably reassures the international community is simply, you know, President-elect Lai is going to be reliable and will not provoke, and will be a steady hand for cross-strait relations as well as, you know, world peace. But what will be the message be between now and May 20th inauguration?
Well, Wenqi, that was the message. I mean,
okay,
frankly,
so that's the thing.
The message of consistency, of steadfast. And I want to say this, Wenqi, because it's important. I mean, we're a democracy, right? I mean, over 80% of our people support the status quo. This has been reinforced again and again. I mean, any party that's going to deviate away from the status quo simply isn't going to get the majority of public opinion here. And so for the DPP, I mean, we're here to win elections. We're here to stand with the people. We're here to reflect the people. And the people want the status quo. We want the status quo. And we certainly hope Beijing ends up supporting the status quo as well, because ultimately the status quo works in everybody's interest, whether it's in Taiwan's, China's, or the international communities.
Now, Ryan, I have to ask you, you've been a longtime Taiwan and China watcher, and you were in the administration, the Obama administration's National Security Council. Is the status quo the same now as the status quo back then? How has this trilateral, meaning U.S.-Taiwan-China relations, changed over time since you've been involved in the work for so long? And will the elections change this relationship or not?
Well, it's a really interesting question, Wenqi, and it gives me a chance to reflect slightly upon the evolution. The first thing that I observe when I listen to people who are new to the Taiwan issue and very excited about the Taiwan issue, particularly in Washington, D.C., is a sense that everything is on a linear trajectory that leads to only one destination, which is conflict. And my experience doesn't lead me to that same conclusion. What I have observed over the years, and thank you for acknowledging my age. I just turned 45 yesterday, so this is very much on my mind. But is that during the Chen Shui-bian era, there was genuine concern that we could find ourselves in a conflict not of our choosing because of actions that were being taken out of Taipei. During the Ma Ying-jeou era, there was a real sense that the relationship across the Taiwan Strait was converging, that there was deepening integration, and that the United States may have a lesser role going forward in the future than it had in the past. And during the Tsai Ing-wen administration, I think that there's been a real recognition of sort of stability and predictability in Taiwan. And yet, in spite of that, increasing cross-strait tensions because of Beijing's growing assertiveness towards Taiwan. The point I'm trying to arrive at is that there has been an ebb and flow to the U.S.-China-Taiwan triangle. It has not traveled in a straight line. It has gone up and down, and I expect that will continue going forward into the Lai administration. And so, to borrow, a term from the Pentagon, I don't think the conflict is neither imminent or inevitable.
Oh, that's a very diplomatic answer. And well, you hope, or the world hopes, that this relationship will not be sort of too out of balance. But however, everyone is changing, every actor in this trilateral relationship. And so we saw that, Nauru, a country in the Pacific, just announced that it would switch diplomatic ties to the People's Republic of China right after the election. and many view this as some kind of warning sign sent by Beijing. And so Vincent and everyone seems to be expecting if Beijing is going to take some actions to show its frustration and anger towards the election results, is Taipei prepared for any potential punishment from Beijing?
Well, let me just start by saying how unfortunate we're having the discussion at all, because I think ultimately the people of Taiwan do want peace, but also want respect for our democracy and our democratic achievements. And by punishing Taiwan for our democratic choices, that's not going to win hearts and minds here in Taipei. And if anything, it's going to set us on a course that is further away from one another and potentially jeopardizes, I think, China's own long-term hopes for how just cross-strait trajectory will pan out. So I do think that ultimately it's counterproductive what China's engaged in, and ultimately it feels like it's serving a domestic purpose rather than, you know, a larger kind of diplomatic or cross-strait intention that they may have in mind in the long term. But I'll say that to start, how unfortunate that is. But I think the truth of the matter is this: is that it really takes two to tango. And so Taiwan has made our intentions very, very clear. Lai Ching-te certainly has, not only through the campaign, but the January 13th election night speech, as I mentioned earlier as well. We've put our goodwill on the table. We've put our willingness to engage on the table. We've made clear that maintaining the cross-strait status quo is in all of our interests, and we're ready to do that. So ultimately, it's a decision that Beijing will have to make on their end as well. Do they want this current trajectory of, I would say, adverse growth on cross-strait relations to continue? Do they want to continue to push aside the people of Taiwan? And do they want to create goodwill? Or do they want to show that they're responsible and pragmatic stakeholder? I mean, again, these are decisions we can't make for Beijing. We can do everything within our power to ensure that the choices are there, but ultimately we can only hope and wish that Beijing does make a responsible choice, which is to work with not only the elected government here in Taipei, but also the international community in the interests of peace and stability here.
Well, but it's likely that, Beijing will continue to exert its coercion towards Taipei. I mean, they've made it very clear that Lai is their least preferred candidate. And so what is the path forward if the coercion continues?
Well, I'll say one thing, which is we're not going back to an old day of confrontation and conflict. That's not in our interests. And despite Chinese actions that may tempt us or the people of Taiwan in that direction, that's not a path that we're ready and willing to embark on. I think our focus has been on keeping the relationship steady and consistent with no surprise framework, despite the many challenges we face. And that takes a lot of political acumen. It takes a lot of political capital, but ultimately, it's reflective of, I think, Taiwan's democratic maturity, like you said. So that's the one point. But the second point is this: we're going to keep our doors open, and our door is open. And there is nothing that can't be sit down and discussed on the basis of parity and dignity. And I mean, these should be principles undergirding any relationship anywhere in the world. But ultimately, we've shown our willingness. And so the ultimate problem in all of this, Wenqi, is that Beijing has these intentions of unification as the only acceptable outcome in their view, peacefully if possible, by force if necessary. And it's unfortunate that almost everything they do is seen through that context. And so ultimately, they're going to, again, have to make a decision about whether they want to also join the international community in keeping peace and stability here, or that they're going to continue to push the people of Taiwan away from chances to create goodwill between the two sides.
Ryan, what do you think? What do you think Beijing will do in the next 4 years? It just seems that, it's unlikely that they will actually be friendly to Taipei, not because of anything that Taipei or President Lai Ching-te will do, but simply because it's the Democratic Progressive Party.
Well, it's very hard for me to predict what Beijing will do. But I do have a few broad principles that I think will guide their overall approach. The first is that I expect that there will be more continuity than discontinuity in the way that Beijing approaches Taiwan issues in the coming years. Because if there were to be a radical departure, it would be an admission or acknowledgement that the previous policy of the past decade that has been being implemented under President Xi has failed. I don't think that they want to acknowledge or suggest that there's been failure. But I also think that Beijing expected these results, these election results. I don't think that they came as a surprise. I don't think that they welcomed or celebrated the results, but they certainly saw them coming. And as you said, we've already seen Beijing repeat what they did in 2016. In 2016, it was the Gambia. In 2024, it is Nauru. It's part of the same playbook of trying to flip diplomatic partners as a registration of displeasure with the outcome of an election. In 2016, their decision on the Gambia, as far as I could tell, did not alter China's foreign or internal policies. I don't think that the decision on Nauru will have any significant long-term effect on the way that Taiwan approaches the world either. So the first sort of yardstick that I would suggest is that there'll be more continuity than discontinuity in the way that Beijing approaches things. The second is that I think that Beijing is going to want to try to preserve escalation space. In other words, to go slow and steady and ratcheting their way up an escalation ladder rather than going straight to the top, because they don't know what is going to happen in the future, and they want to preserve the ability to increase their response to events that they are opposed to. And so
it sounds like they have a lot of tools. I mean, according to your logic, I mean, it sounds like what they have been doing is simply just, one step towards even much more.
Yeah, I think that we should acknowledge that Beijing does have ample tools to apply pressure on Taiwan if and when it chooses to do so. But Taiwan also has options and choices about its approach as well. And I think that measuring Taiwan's international space on the basis of the number of diplomatic allies that it has is sort of a backward-facing measure of Taiwan's international space. The real, I think, measure is to what degree does Taiwan enjoy dignity and respect on the world stage? And I would argue in recent years that has increased rather than decreased, even though the number of diplomatic partners that officially recognize Taiwan has gone down. And the reason why it has done so is because Taiwan has done an effective job of demonstrating itself as a solutions provider to challenges that other countries and regions face around the world. And I expect that Taiwan will continue down that path and will continue to enjoy dignity and respect for the contributions it makes, irrespective of what pressure Beijing applies upon Taiwan's diplomatic partners.
And what do you think Beijing will do between now and Lai's inauguration?
Well, this may be a question for Vincent. I think he's closer to it than I am. But I expect that we will see continuing measures, increments of pressure being placed upon President Lai. We could see more in the economic space. There may be some military signaling around Taiwan. But again, to go back to where I was before, I don't think that they're going to go from 0 to 100 in the next 4 months. I think that they're going to slowly, steadily try to increase their pressure.
Vincent, do you think, based on your understanding, from the campaign as well as President Lai, what's the chance of Beijing and Taipei actually engage in any dialogue in the next 4 years?
These things are difficult to predict, Wenqi. I'm not a soothsayer, but, certainly I have some observations and perspectives. And there it is. It ultimately depends really on Beijing's calculations on what they want out of this relationship and whether they're willing to work with Taipei, because Taipei, we've made our position clear again and again. I couldn't make it more clear because I could just refer people all day to comments that Lai Ching has made, for the last few months on dialogue, on the status quo, on maintaining the constitutional framework, on ensuring stability, pragmatism, and a no surprise approach. I mean, all of these things have been said and done. But I think it's ultimately this, Wenqi, because we've discussed a lot back and forth about Beijing's responses. And the fact of the matter is that no one can predict Beijing's responses for the simple reason that they're not tied to basically the rationality we see on the diplomatic stage. There's a lot of different factors that are factoring in at this point. Domestic politics, the domestic economic sentiment, social pressures, political pressures within the CCP. And so much of that takes place behind the scenes that it's almost impossible, I would argue at this point, for anybody to predict with any amount of certainty kind of where policies are going to lead within the CCP. But we do know this. We do know that within every calculation, that it has to be based on rationality, particularly, to the part that we can ensure our own rationality in this calculation. And so, we're going to continue to make our policies consistent. We're going to continue to increase deterrence. We're going to continue to work with international friends and partners to ensure that war is an unthinkable option for any party involved. And ultimately, I think that is also going to take options away from the CCP or ensure that options don't, materialize for the CCP that would have an adverse outcome in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, it sounds like even though President-elect Lai has been saying, he's willing to sit down with Beijing, but obviously it has to be based on an equal basis, and it has to be a meaningful dialogue, not just symbolic. And so there really doesn't present any sense of urgency right now from how I have observed. And Ryan, do you think Beijing feels that there is a sense of urgency to actually talk to Taipei? The feeling, again, as an observer, is that Beijing is just unwilling to engage with the DPP government. They don't want to give the DPP the legitimacy. Is that your sense as well? But then, if there is a crisis, how do you really manage the both sides?
Well, I think that Vincent was right in suggesting that we all have a degree of modesty in forecasting how Beijing will approach and deal with these issues. But with that as a given, I don't expect that Beijing is soon going to be reaching out to try to directly and visibly engage with President-elect Lai or his team. I think that would be a bit of an acknowledgement that their previous approach towards President Tsai has failed. I hope that there are ways privately for both sides to communicate directly with each other so that they both have clarity of each other's top interests and top concerns.
Is there a way for both sides to communicate each other now, Vincent?
Well, I can say that, on some certain aspects, there is communication out of necessity, for example, on economic issues and customs issues and some law enforcement issues. And this has been made public, obviously, throughout the years as well. But, I think ultimately there needs to be a decision made at a political level in Beijing that these sorts of exchanges need to take place with frequency and at a higher level. And they need to lead to, I think, a stronger understanding of the importance of mutual trust and confidence building. So, again, these are decisions that ultimately Beijing will have to make.
Well, with that, I want to thank both Vincent and Ryan for sharing your insights right after the elections. And Vincent, I do hope you get a moment to rest a bit. I know you've been working for months so hard on this. A question, will you join the administration?
I will not. Actually, I look forward to returning to my job as the Taipei City Council. I was a happy volunteer for the course of the campaign, but I do have a full-time job waiting for me, and I look forward to being back.
Yeah, I hope they did pay you for this additional work as well.
I can emphasize the word volunteer and people can understand.
It's all out of passion and commitment, obviously.
That's right. That's right.
So,
we fight a good fight.
Yeah. Beyond its relationship with China, there's more on the minds of Taiwan voters. Nearly 2 decades after the first direct presidential election, the Taiwanese people elected the DPP to safeguard its sovereign status quo, while a coalition of opposition parties assumed the role of monitoring the DPP. So the narrative of Taiwan depicts a vibrant and authentic democracy. Stay tuned for more insightful discussions on TVBS Meeting Room. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Vincent. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.